The brutal last hours of William Wallace before his savage execution. They didn't just execute William Wallace. They tried to destroy him in front of an entire city. Dragged through the streets of London, bleeding, beaten, barely conscious. He wasn't being taken to die. He was being turned into a message. In 1305, after years of defying Edward I of England, Wallace was finally captured. But what followed wasn't justice. It was a performance, a slow, calculated display designed to break not just his body, but the idea of rebellion itself. Crowds gathered, officials watched. Every step was planned. But here's what they didn't expect. Because the way Wallace faced those final hours didn't silence him, it made him impossible to erase. The morning of August 23, 1305, didn't begin like an execution. It began like a performance. By then, William Wallace was no longer just a captured rebel. He was a symbol the English crown needed to dismantle publicly. And in medieval England, that meant turning punishment into spectacle. After his capture near Glasgow, Wallace had been transported under heavy guard to London, the political heart of England. But this wasn't a quiet transfer. Every mile of the journey was deliberate, designed to show that even the most defiant enemy could be reduced to nothing. By the time he arrived, word had already spread. Crowds gathered, not just out of curiosity, but because they were meant to witness something unforgettable. Wallace was brought before a tribunal in Westminster Hall. The charges? Treason against the English king, Edward I of England. But here's where the tension sharpens. Wallace didn't accept the accusation. According to historical accounts, he reportedly argued that he could not be a traitor because he had never sworn allegiance to Edward in the first place. It wasn't just defiance, it was a direct challenge to the authority trying to condemn him. The trial itself was swift, almost symbolic. The outcome had been decided long before Wallace ever stepped into that hall. This wasn't about justice, it was about sending a message. And the message was clear. Resistance would not just be defeated. It would be humiliated, broken, and displayed. Once the sentence was pronounced, the real ordeal began. Wallace was stripped of any remaining dignity and prepared for one of the most brutal punishments in medieval Europe: execution by hanging, drawing, and quartering. It wasn't just a method of death. It was a ritual of domination. Every stage had a purpose, and every moment was designed to be seen. He was tied to a wooden hurdle, a crude wooden frame, and dragged through the streets of London. Imagine the scene: uneven roads, stones cutting into his body, crowds pressing in from both sides. Some shouted, some jeered, some simply watched. The journey itself was part of the punishment, turning the city into a stage where Wallace was both the central figure and the warning. But what makes this moment so striking isn't just the brutality. It's the silence in the historical record about Wallace begging for mercy. There's no dramatic plea, no collapse under pressure. Instead, what emerges from accounts is a man who endured the process without giving his captors the satisfaction they wanted: submission. By the time he reached Smithfield, the site chosen for the execution, the atmosphere had shifted. This wasn't just about punishment anymore. It had become something larger, something symbolic. Wallace, battered and exhausted, was still the same man who had once led Scottish forces at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. And that memory lingered, even here, even now. The execution that followed would be one of the most infamous in British history, but what's often overlooked is how carefully it was orchestrated before it even began. Every step leading up to it was designed to dismantle not just Wallace the man, but Wallace the idea. And yet there's a paradox here, because the more the crown tried to display its absolute power, the more it revealed its fear. Fear of what Wallace represented. Fear that even in chains, even in defeat, his story could outlive the spectacle meant to destroy it. As the crowd gathered tighter and the final moments approached, one thing was becoming clear. This wasn't going to end the way the crown intended, because sometimes the way a man faces his last hours doesn't erase his legacy, it defines it. By the time William Wallace reached Smithfield, the crowd had thickened into something almost suffocating. This wasn't just another execution, it was a moment the crown wanted etched into memory. Officials, soldiers, and civilians pressed in, all drawn to what they believed would be the final, crushing end of Scotland's most defiant rebel. But what followed wasn't just punishment. It was calculated brutality, carried out step by step. Wallace was first hanged, but not to death. The executioners knew exactly how long to leave him suspended, just enough to bring him to the edge, not enough to end his life. When he was cut down, barely conscious, the real horror began. This was the part designed not just to kill him, but to erase him. Accounts describe how he was subjected to mutilation while still alive, an act meant to symbolize the destruction of a traitor's body and soul. It's difficult to even process by modern standards, but in the medieval mindset, this was justice amplified into spectacle. Every movement, every moment carried a message. This is what happens to those who challenge the king. And yet, even here, something didn't go according to plan, because Wallace didn't break. There are no credible records of him begging, no documented pleas for mercy that would satisfy the narrative the crown wanted. Instead, what survives in historical memory is the image of a man enduring the unimaginable without giving his captors the one thing they sought most: submission. Whether every detail has been dramatized over time or not, the core truth remains. Wallace's death did not deliver the clean, fear-driven conclusion Edward I of England had intended. It did the opposite. After his death, Wallace's body was divided, his head placed on display at London Bridge, and his limbs sent to different parts of the kingdom. This wasn't random, it was psychological warfare. The crown wanted his presence to linger as a warning long after his life had ended. But here's where history takes a turn the executioners couldn't control. Instead of fading into fear, Wallace's story spread, not as a cautionary tale, but as inspiration. In Scotland, his name didn't become a symbol of defeat, it became a rallying cry. His execution, meant to crush resistance, instead fueled it. Within a decade, figures like Robert the Bruce would rise, carrying forward the same fight Wallace had once led, and that's the irony at the heart of it all. The English crown staged one of the most brutal executions in medieval history to prove absolute power, but power, when pushed to extremes like this, can backfire. Because people don't just remember fear, they remember courage in the face of it. Wallace's final hours were meant to end a rebellion. Instead, they immortalized one. Even today, centuries later, his story still resonates, not because of how he died, but because of how he faced it. The spectacle designed to erase him became the very reason he could never be forgotten. And maybe that's the real lesson buried in those final hours. You can control how someone dies. You can't control what they come to represent. So the next time you hear the name William Wallace, don't just think about the legend or the films or the myths that grew around him. Think about that moment in Smithfield, surrounded by a crowd, facing something no one should ever have to endure, and still refusing to give his enemies the ending they wanted. Because that's where history stops being just a story and becomes something much harder to silence. If you want more stories like this, the raw, unfiltered moments history tried to bury, make sure you subscribe and stay with the channel. Because some of the most powerful stories aren't the ones we're taught, they're the ones we almost lost.